One of the things I like to do after making these videos is to read the comments, and from those comments I get an idea of what things I need to improve on or insight from other viewers' experiences, and also I get to answer any questions that they might have. And one of those questions was about finding the right parts for their machines. I know I had a hard time finding these parts when I first started, so I'm going to show you how I find the parts that I need. Believe me, it's a lot easier than you think. If you're working on a small engine and need to find a part for it, how do you find the right part? The reason is, if you don't find the correct one, you could cause some serious issues that you didn't have before, and believe me, if you do get the wrong part, trying to figure out what just happened and then realizing you got the wrong part only makes getting the next replacement part a little bit more unnerving. In today's video, we're going to look into the challenges I've had to overcome while trying to find parts for the equipment I work on. Now, you might be wondering, how hard is it to find parts online or at a small engine shop for your machine? And you're right, it's not hard at all, but for some, finding the right parts can be very challenging. Years ago, when I first started doing this kind of hobby, I didn't know about model numbers, revisions, and serial numbers. I just figured the machine I was working on was called whatever it was on the sticker. But it turns out things aren't that easy, and sometimes I almost have to wonder if that was done on purpose. So the first problem with finding parts for your machine is deciding what the issue really is in the first place. It's very unfortunate, but what I typically find is that someone working on fixing a piece of equipment will simply load a parts cannon with everything they can find for that machine, light the fuse, and let the parts fly, hoping that when they get done installing all the parts, it's going to start and run like it's supposed to. I hate to admit this, but that doesn't happen all too often. So the first problem is trying to find out what the problem really is. Unfortunately, that's one of the hardest things of fixing anything. For example, years ago, I had a coworker that started working on small engines as well. When I asked them how it was going, they said they had bought several parts and replaced them all, but it was still having issues. I asked them what parts they had replaced, and it turns out they had basically loaded a parts cannon and lit the fuse. It turns out they didn't know what the problem actually was. They just changed all the parts they wanted to, not the one they needed to. Now, this sometimes works, especially if you accidentally change the part that was the issue. But if you do it this way, you might replace the parts that didn't need changing, and in the end, you'll have wasted your time and, more importantly, your money. In my mind, it's best to put work and time into finding the part that's having the issue and then either fixing it or replacing it. If you hadn't guessed it, my coworker had replaced everything around the engine except the carb. So I asked them why didn't they load the parts cannon with a new carb as well, and their answer was that it was too expensive and that it would have taken too much effort to replace, not that they didn't think that it was the issue. Now, this might sound like they were being lazy, but it makes sense. It's an issue of them not doing the diagnostic work to find out what the problem really was, but instead just replacing as many parts as they were comfortable with and hoping that it basically works out. So that means before we even start looking for parts online, we need to find out what part or parts we need to replace first, which can be the most frustrating thing. That's the reason the parts cannon is loaded so often, because it's easier. Now, this video wasn't meant to be about diagnosing engine issues, so we're going to assume we already know the part we need. Now, to make things a little bit easier to visualize, what I'm going to do is use some of my past projects like this mower, but don't worry, we'll come back to the chainsaw here in a bit. The first thing that you want to do is find the model number of the machine you're working on. Now, it should be on a label somewhere on the mower body and not the engine itself. Then you'll need to find a good website to look up your parts. Now, I'm not here to push or promote any one website. There are many places online that you can do the same thing on. All you have to do is search for small engine parts, and several of the most popular sites should show up. On the main page, it's going to ask you for the model number of the machine you're working on. Enter the model number and then press search. After that, you should get a results page. Fortunately for us, there was only one result, so we didn't even need the serial number to narrow it down. But some of your results might come up with multiple findings, at which point the serial number is going to help out a lot. Click on the Parts and Diagrams button, and you should find all the parts that this particular site has available. Just a word of caution, this is when you're going to find out just how many parts might not be available for that machine you're working on as well, so keep that in mind. So let's say for some reason you want to replace these two pieces for the pull rope that holds the rope against the handle. And let's say for some reason you don't know what they're called. I'd simply enter the word rope in the search field and the result should come back that's related to the pull rope. Now luckily they do have pictures, and apparently these are called a T-knob, and I'm sure that's supposed to be guide rope. The best part is that I can order the parts I need right from the site. Just don't be surprised by the shipping prices. But who's really going to order anything so trivial? Let's try something a bit more difficult. How about stuff that's going to eventually need replacing, like the blade adapter, and maybe even the idler pulley for the self-propel belt? So it turns out the blade is almost $16, and they have plenty in stock, as well as the adapter, which is almost $11. If you look up the pulley, we get 2 results. Just make sure you pick the right one, and luckily it's only a little over $7 for either one. But what happens when you don't want to pay these prices? Simple, take the part numbers and search online for a better price, and hopefully with free shipping. So far so good, but what happens if we search for some of the handlebar parts? This is when you're going to get disappointed. Engine parts are predictably going to be needed throughout the years, but they don't seem to treat the mowing decks the same way. Now after putting it in the search field, this is what we find. The word discontinued appears all over the place. Hopefully you didn't need one of these, but if you do, don't get discouraged. Now you can still search online for other sites that might have them. Just don't be surprised if the sites you find them on are online auction sites and are of course used, but used is better than not having the right parts. Unfortunately, this particular mower needed new handlebars, and this was the best they could do, but they wouldn't stay in the correct position, so I had to modify them to work better. This is one of the results of getting the wrong parts, but that's just some handlebars. What happens if you get an engine part that's not right? The answer isn't good. For something that goes inside your engine, I think it would be best if you picked something that was OEM quality, but if you're on a tight budget, which I completely understand, aftermarket should be fine, although I can't vouch for how long it's going to work for. So what you see before you is the infamous Newer Briggs overhead valve engine, or post flathead, side valve, or whatever you call it in your neck of the woods, and unfortunately OEM quality has a different meaning for these engines. The majority of these mowers from front to back and even top to bottom has been designed to incorporate as much plastic as possible, and the results are quite staggering. The feel you get from these mowers is best described as cheap and toy-like. Now don't think I'm just being mean to Briggs and Stratton. Even my brand of choice has gone the way of Ken and Barbie as well, and unfortunately it shows. There are reports of recoil issues and parts wearing out faster than they should, and things have changed, and unfortunately not for the better. Fortunately for these plastic engine parts, the aftermarket parts seem to be on the exact same quality level as the parts they're replacing, so there's absolutely zero regrets when buying and installing them. It's one thing when the parts are made out of metal and there's a good chance they're going to last for quite some time, but when it's plastic, there's no guarantee at all they're not going to fail even within the year. It's also very unfortunate because after searching for a new carb for this Briggs engine, for some reason this site doesn't come up with any results. Like I said before, there are plenty of other sites you can check on and you will find some. Hopefully though, it's the right one. In these situations, I would definitely try and save the original carb if possible. But what happens when you cannot find any parts for your particular machine? Well, this is when things get pretty dicey. Not only do you need to get creative, but you're going to have to think outside of the box. That's the very situation that came up when trying to find parts for a very rare Tanaka chainsaw. The key word being rare, or generally impossible to find. That's one of the biggest reasons to not buy something that's out of date: parts. Now, if it's working, great, buy it. But just keep in mind that you probably don't want to make it your daily driver, because if it breaks down, you're in trouble. After doing the diagnostic, we figured out that it didn't have a working ignition system. Now, I was surprised to find the parts diagram for the saw, but as you guessed it, I was disappointed to see that the part I needed was yet again discontinued. So what now? Unfortunately, there's not much you can do. Now, you can keep trying and hope you can find one, or you can find a different machine that might have a part that will work for your application, but you are taking a huge risk. So what's my advice? Now this is going to be a tough one. I typically tell you to buy all the old machines you can, and if you get enough of them, you'll be able to hold out against the wave of change headed our way. But if you can't find more than the one lone old machine, getting parts for it is going to be impossible. Unfortunately, that means my best recommendation is to either buy not the current model and not a vintage model, but the previous model, and the reason is aftermarket support. As much as I want to hold on to my old flathead, at some point in the next few years, finding parts will become a bit tougher, or the parts won't be cheap anymore because they know you're trying to hold out from buying a $100 replacement battery for your $300 electric trimmer. That $12 carb on Amazon is going to be $18 next year and $25 the year after that. That still doesn't sound too bad, but one day it is going to be more expensive than a replacement battery. Then you're going to have to make a hard choice. Now, I can't see into the future, but I like to think I can see when a trend is coming. That means you can either get out of the way, get on board, or let it run you over. As for finding the right parts for your equipment, as long as money can still be made in replacement parts, there will be someone who will make them and someone to sell them, but once that reason is gone, there's no hope in keeping these machines up and running anymore. So in my opinion, buying the right parts for your machine can be very tough, but if your machine isn't too old or special, meaning a limited production item, the parts should be available in some way, either in OEM quality and definitely in the aftermarket. And when you start to have problems finding parts, well, it's time to upgrade. Thank you for watching. I really do appreciate your time here. Please feel free to ask me any questions about this project or your own projects, and I hope to see you in the next video.